background or whatever.
Sure.
I'm saying when I introduce you, biochemist.
Oh,
Well, yeah,
he's the man. That's all
Yeah.
you say.
Okay, that's good
Yes.
enough. All right. Here we go. Hello and welcome to episode 16 of the Restoring Human podcast, where we believe humans were designed to flourish. Unfortunately, many modern conveniences prevent us from thriving, but through intentional lifestyle decisions, we can return to an optimal state of health. I'm your host, Jared Bakken,
I'm Dr. Alex McWell.
and today we are joined by the man, Jared Criswell.
Yep.
Yes, he is the man.
Thanks for being here today with us, Jared. Before we get going, hey, welcome back. It's been a few weeks. I'll throw my own self under the bus. I've been way too busy with other things to be able to pull this off. But I think you can probably expect a little more consistency now moving forward,
Yeah.
back to normal.
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to blame it all on you. I mean, most of it on you, but I always have a lot of stuff on my plate. So anytime there's something that can be cut out is good. So
Anytime I make an excuse, Alex will take it.
Well, definitely wasn't my fault.
So today, our topic is a hot button. Sorry, I shouldn't even say that. I'll just say GMOs.
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 Yeah.
Jared, what qualifies you to kind of be on here talking about this with us?
Well, I watch a lot of TV. I'm just kidding. I have a
Actually, let me answer that a little bit. So one of the things that we would like to try to do a lot more of is just bringing on other people that have some experience or expertise in a certain area of health. Number one, either because we want to learn more about it, and number two, just because we want our listeners to be hearing from other people. So our hope is to bring a lot more people on here in this way. And when we think about this particular topic, it's just a difficult topic to research, I think, to really know who's giving you good information. So my go-to when I ask questions about this is, the typical people that I research just normal health stuff on. But I can just tell just in reading their stuff that they don't necessarily even know what the right thing is to think about this. So my other go-to has been Jared for that, just because of his scientific background and being able to read stuff, research stuff that nobody else really wants to read. So that's what I would say why we wanted him to be on here, but he can add to that.
Yeah, so I have a master's degree in biochemistry. Got that at Iowa State. So a lot of work and academic training in the field of biological sciences. You come across genetic research and how that affects enzymes, and biochemistry itself is really just the chemistry of what goes on in our cells. So you get proteins, enzymes, hormones, all that good stuff. So my specific, niche when I was in graduate school was diterpene cyclases, which is just
Say that one more time.
There's no other word for it, but essentially,
No layman term.
essentially, what we were looking at was you can take natural products from plants, and they're very biochemically active for humans. Obviously, we eat food, we need those nutrients, but they're also very medically active. So there's a lot of research being done to figure out ways to make more of it, usually through a system of yeast or E. coli growing it inside bacteria. That's how actually insulin is being made right now. Is they took the genes and inserted them in E. coli, and then they just grow up huge bioreactors of E. coli, produces the insulin for people.
Cool.
So just research that's just related to all that.
Yeah.
And then the diterpenes are just the chemicals that I was looking at as that class of chemicals. So
Okay. And what are you doing now?
well,
Unrelated?
unrelated.
Okay.
Well, it's not necessarily super unrelated to this topic, though.
No, I work with wastewater pollution control, and it is kind of related because there are, one of the steps in treating the wastewater is actually biological treatment. So all the nutrients and waste chemicals that get into the water, they put it in these huge reactor basins and they just pump oxygen in there, and then they just let the microbes digest.
Yeah.
So
Interesting stuff. All right.
We'll clarify all that, I'm sure, sometime.
yeah.
So our topic for today, GMOs. First of all, what the heck does that even mean?
That's all you, Jared.
Well, GMO stands for, I think everybody knows, genetically modified organism, but I think the term you really want to think about is when we say GMOs, we're talking about a transgenic organism, meaning we're taking a gene from one organism and inserting it into another.
Mm-hmm.
A lot different than like a hybrid where you're transferring pollen from, same types of plants. You can take a gene from a bacteria, a gene from, I think, even a fish. You can put it in a corn so that you can get these desirable traits that will stand up to certain environmental stresses
Okay.
that supposedly a organic plant or an all-natural plant would not.
So, where did this even come from? Why does such a crazy thing even exist?
Well, I think there's a lot of debate on that question. We've been watching this video seminar series that's just come out, and one of the things that they said was when glyphosate was introduced into the world, it's a it's a non-specific weed killer. So you spray it and it'll kill anything it touches.
Mm-hmm.
So that's very convenient, for a farmer, if they can just spray that on their field. Can we make our crops resistant to that? So we can just spray this all over and our crops will still grow, but we'll, very efficiently kill the weeds.
Everything else.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think, again, this is a complex issue, but I think what most people know about a GMO is, that people think it's not necessarily natural, so it's totally synthetic or totally artificial. Some people think it's necessary because there's so many people on the planet now that if we weren't doing this to have bigger yields, then we wouldn't have enough food for everybody on the planet. And then, of course, there's the people that are totally against them. They're saying, oh, that's all totally wrong, and we could feed the planet, and we're not even feeding the planet well, even though we have genetically modified foods. And why would you even want to feed the planet those type of foods? Because they're, of course, not natural, so you don't want to, they're just going to make everybody sick. And I guess before I even started talking to Jared, from a philosophical standpoint, I was against genetically modified foods just because of a lot of the stuff that I just said, but without even looking into it too deeply and understanding any of the scientific stuff, I was just like, anytime we try to intervene with nature, just the way that it was designed to work, things seem to go bad, So without having a full understanding of what the whole genetically modified process was, that's all I knew about it. Is it wasn't just the way that things were naturally. So
right.
I was just kind of, I guess, by principle, just against it.
Right, just naturally throwing a red flag.
Yeah, yeah, and again, just because I knew that you had a choice, like we didn't have to eat it. We didn't have to eat these things, so why not avoid them if we could, until we know more about what's going on.
Sure.
And I still think they're pretty, I guess, somewhat new, that we don't really have a ton of information about them to know if they're absolutely bad or no, they're perfectly fine for people. And one of the things that I've got from you, and maybe you can hit on this a little bit, Jared, is there are some, I guess, maybe some studies that would show there's some terrible things that happen, and maybe that's not the best research done, or, maybe it was just a certain type of research that was done that we would then require more specific type of research, or there's some things that we know potentially could be harmful, but we just don't know enough of the information yet.
Right. Yeah, I think most of the research that's been done on these GMOs and their potential danger or safety to our diet, our health, has been basically feeding studies. So that take some rats, feed one group of rats a non-GMO diet, another group of rats a GMO diet. And, some studies have, they don't see any problems with that. And then there's been a couple that, these rats fed the GMOs have been, all sorts of tumors and other problems. Mm-hmm. But the problem with those kinds of studies is, well, number one, rats are, very, very, sensitive to everything.
Yeah.
So it's, so that most of those results are like, well, we can't really see these as legitimate because,
sure,
this probably would have happened even if this group was fed a regular diet. So to me, I think what's lacking in the research for the safety of GMOs is, without going into too much of the process of how they're made, is when you insert a gene into the DNA of a plant, a gene that it's not intended to have originally, you're going to get a lot of mutations. I think I was just reading an article, and they were looking at the Roundup Ready soybean. They were just looking at its genome before and after an insertion event. And I think there was hundreds of base pairs. Like, DNA is comprised of 4 bases, letters, if anyone remembers from high school biology or whatever. But essentially, it's a code, and it's made up of 4 bases, which are represented to us as letters when we do the work on them, do research. And when they did an insertion event, they're seeing hundreds of these extra base pairs being added into the DNA. Superfluous DNA is what they call it. And the concern, I think, to me, is when I see mutations like that happening, immediately red flags go off in my head as a, considering the background that I have. And I think where it comes down to how it's going to affect us and our diet is DNA gets expressed as proteins. And when those proteins interface with other proteins and receptors in our gut, or even just throughout the rest of our cells, chemistry starts to happen. And so when we have superfluous DNA that's being randomly showing up in these insertion events for making a transgenic plant, you're going to probably get superfluous proteins. And who knows, what's going on between these proteins and the receptors and bacteria and stuff in your gut.
So go ahead.
Well, okay, so like, okay, what I am digesting that as like layman's terms. Mm-hmm. When this, whatever is injected to the DNA of this plant, mutation other than the intended purpose is happening, correct? Mm-hmm. When mutated whatever, vegetable, whatever it is, starts to interact with my gut, my body, that's going to produce more cell mutation. Is that like kind of what you're saying?
I wouldn't say necessarily it would produce more cell mutation. I guess that's possible, but it would possibly just throw off the biochemistry that's happening in your cells, because the proteins will interact with other proteins in your cells.
So, okay, a better way to put that is like we talk a lot about our bodies being in a state of homeostasis. It's going to be working against that.
Right.
Okay.
Possibly.
Okay.
But we know that happens for sure with plants.
Right. Well, we know it happens for sure with Roundup Ready soybeans because, I mean, that's what I've been reading.
Yeah.
And the studies that have been done, those mutations are there. So
my understanding of it is like, and maybe this was done on the actual Roundup itself, that chemical, which we'll get into in a little bit here, I think. But that the reason that they could see it as ingesting that stuff is safe is because even though they knew it would cause damage and was potentially toxic to the plants or potentially toxic to even microorganisms, like there was nothing that showed that it was toxic to us and would cause those things. So that's kind of why they said it's potentially safe.
Yeah.
So kind of the study that needs to be done, or kind of what we're waiting to see is, is there a way of proving that it actually has a somewhat of an effect on us, a toxic effect on us?
The Roundup?
Yeah, or just GMOs or Roundup.
Yeah, well, as far as the GMOs go, I haven't really seen any specific characterization of the superfluous DNA that happens when you do an insertion event with a transgene. As far as Roundup goes, the glyphosate and the Roundup, that the reason why they think it's okay if we ingest a little bit is the glyphosate, it targets a specific enzyme in what's called the shikimate pathway, which is a pathway that is responsible for forming tryptophan, which is an amino acid. And it essentially just kind of shuts this enzyme down so that tryptophan cannot be produced. So whatever plant has been susceptible to this dies. You can't live without all the amino acids. Mm-hmm. We don't have the shikimate pathway in our DNA. So as the theory goes, it does not target anything in our genetic or biological biochemical makeup.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
But there's potentially something that's inside of us that does have require the shikimate, which, by the way, that's the coolest word we've had on this podcast, I think. Yeah. Shikimate pathway.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should say, when we say pathway, what a biosynthetic pathway is in a cell is it's essentially just a collection of enzymes. These enzymes will take I'll just say chemical, what's called a substrate, and it will bind to it, and it'll change it in some way, and then it'll move on to the next enzyme. It'll change it, move on to the next enzyme, it'll change it. That's a biosynthetic pathway. And so the shikimate pathway, I don't remember what it's named after, but that's the one that produces tryptophan. The thing is, we have a lot of bacteria in our gut, and a lot of bacteria use the shikimate pathway. And so through our diet and through these bacteria, that's kind of our source for tryptophan.
So you as a person, your DNA does not use this pathway, but the organisms inside of you who have their own separate DNA do.
Yeah.
Okay. So basically, as long as you ignore the fact that we've got these other organisms inside of us that are a part of us, but yet like somehow different from us, then you can just say it's not even contextual.
Right.
Yeah.
Sleazy.
Yeah.
Which would be a really unwise thing to do if you ever wanted to have an episode about gut microbiome.
Oh, we'll get there for sure.
Well, yeah, just to hit on a little bit, like we have this, what's called a symbiotic relationship with them, meaning like there's things about us that's good for them, and then there's things about them that is good for us, basically. Mm-hmm. So if we damage them, then that's going to lead to problems in us, and that's been very clear. And again, that's something that's we've known for a long time, but it's also somewhat pretty new of all the things that's relating to. how gut issues cause brain issues, how gut issues cause skin issues, how gut issues, of course, cause gut issues, but just really every organ system in the body can be negatively affected from gut issues.
Yeah.
But just so, like you talked about, we need these gut bacteria to be able to produce this amino acid tryptophan, which then leads to other things like serotonin, leads to melatonin. So melatonin allows us to get into a sleep. Serotonin has to do with just our this kind of state that we're in. So there's related to depression or anxiety, serotonin levels in our body. Those type of things are going to be more common in people that have issues with serotonin. So it definitely, once you bring the whole microbiome, the gut bacteria that we have inside of our body or inside of our gut, when you bring that into it, that's when really the question of, are GMOs good for us? Is what's being sprayed on GMOs good for us? That's where really the problems come in at.
Right. Okay. So what you just said there, like, it's not only just the mutation that's happening within the organism, it's also like this other layer of there's these chemicals that are being put on here, and like that's kind of the whole purpose of this. What is that doing to us?
Yeah. What's the chemicals doing to us?
Like the Roundup. Yeah.
Well, I think that's kind of what we've been talking about. That's the thing that destroys that shikimate pathway. Like, we're not sure what the actual genes getting inside of us doing what that does. He's saying that there's potential for that to happen, which would then lead to more mutations, which we don't really even know what would cause. But the thing we know for sure is the shikimate path. You correct me on anything I'm getting wrong here, but we know for sure that shikimate pathway being interrupted will cause us to not be able to produce these amino acids, which then lead to issues that we have.
Got it.
So maybe we should just go back to, because I mean, I guess you can kind of separate, like, are GMOs okay? Is glyphosate okay? Or Roundup okay? But they go together a lot of the time, so it's not really a separation we can make.
Sure. Because, like, one wouldn't exist without the other. Like, for the average person, like, they're not going to have one coming in contact with themselves without the other, typically.
Yeah, typically. I mean, that's not to say that they're 100% conflated. I mean, they developed Roundup for a lot of other purposes.
Sure. Okay.
And, in some of the GMOs that are being developed are not just to be resistant to Roundup, but also to be resistant to maybe drought or other environmental stresses. But I would say the Roundup is probably the main thing, because it's made it so convenient for farmers to, kill the weeds in their crops.
So maybe we should kind of go back to kind of how this all, because I think when there's this argument of are they okay or are they not, it's like we're not thinking about, I guess, the historical context of how it even came to be like this. Maybe if we understood that, and I'm going to try to go through that whole process, but you listened to that Zach Bush guy more than I did, I think, so maybe you could tell it a little better. But where this kind of started, I guess, is...
what's the problem?
So our soil was healthy and thriving, right? And one of the things that our soil needs to be healthy and thriving is it needs minerals, right? So all the different minerals, the manganese, the copper, the magnesium, the nitrogen, all those different things. So it needs those things. And then instead of using like compost or just natural fertilizers to make sure that we can continue that process and feeding the soil what it needs, as we went to more petroleum-based fertilizers.
Right.
Which have some of those minerals, those nutrients that the soil needs, but it doesn't have all of them. And when we started to fertilize it with those petroleum-based products, then that's kind of what the soil became. That's, I guess it came, the majority of the minerals that were in the soil were those ones that are just based in petroleum. So just like us, when we are deficient in nutrients and toxic with stuff, our defenses go down, our immune system gets weaker, so we're susceptible to bugs, viruses, parasites, all these things that can attack us and cause us problems. And the same thing happens with soil. If it's devoid of nutrients that it needs to have its defenses, then now, it can be destroyed. So now bugs and stuff and whatever else comes and eats the plants. So it's kind of a problem that was created by what we were doing to the soil.
Mm-hmm.
And then now we have another problem of bugs coming after and killing the plants. So then the process continues. Right now we have to find something to eliminate that process.
Right.
So we came up with something to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And then we had another problem, which was weeds.
Mm-hmm.
So now, yes, we want our crops to grow, but what grows with is weeds.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that plays into kind of the soil being devoid too, of why so many more weeds were growing.
Yeah.
You add in anytime you want here.
So I think when you're talking about the history there, kind of, what you're touching on is when you think about the soil, there's this thing called the nitrogen cycle. So organic material is after a crop has been picked, the corn stalks or whatever are left in the field.
Mm-hmm.
Then there's supposed to be microbes in the field that digest those organic materials and then release the nitrates, the phosphates, and the sulfates that the plants use to grow and thrive. When you start using fertilizers, you are spraying nitrates, phosphates, and sulfates onto the soil, but the analogy I always like to use is it's kind of like living off candy versus a full course meal, because these bacteria are meant to thrive in the soil and digest this organic material and produce the nutrients you need, and that's kind of there permanently. You would have to reapply fertilizer over and over again to keep the nutrients there, because it just doesn't last very long for the plants relative to a microbial.
Sure.
Yeah.
And the microbes in the soil will also fight against funguses and certain bugs. And I think one of the things you were talking about, having these bugs is another problem. Another type of GMO crop was developed at that time with BT corn.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah. So again, it's somewhat the whole thing that we're trying to get at with this podcast of why we call it Restoring Human is there's a way that kind of we've lived as humans and we lived in this relationship with nature. And anytime we try to intervene and do something different than just how nature works, there's potential for problems to happen. And then when those problems happen, we have to try to figure out another way of fixing that problem. And then it might fix it short term, but then it just leads to other problems down the road. Mm-hmm. And I think maybe where we're at with genetically modified foods and the problems that they potentially could cause and the problems that the glyphosate is causing that are with the genetically modified foods is just now we have to figure out that problem, I guess, of getting around that. Mm-hmm. And instead of figuring out that problem, I think because maybe we can't figure out that problem, there's just been a lot to try to get around is it bad by avoiding the research that needs to be done or whatever else they're doing to try to keep that quiet.
Yeah, I mean it's a pretty sobering thought when you think about like for instance the BT corn. What they did there was they took a gene from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis, I think is how you pronounce it. This is a type of bacteria. This bacteria makes a toxin called a cryotoxin, and this binds to receptors in the midgut of larvae of a whole bunch of different insects. Well, this bacteria is supposed to just exist in the soil, and I think there's a lot of farmers that actually just spray the bacteria on their crop, and they thought it'd be easier if we just had our corn just produce this toxin on its own. Mm-hmm. Well, the problem is, in my opinion, is they're starting to see these bugs that it was initially targeted for arising a resistance to
the
cryotoxin that is in the corn now. And the cryotoxin doesn't have a problem. We don't have a problem with. We don't have a receptor that binds it. When you eat corn that's been sprayed with the bacteria, you're going to get some of the toxin in your system. But we've been ingesting that bacteria for thousands of years, and it's not been a problem. But now that these bugs there's a population of them that are resistant. The way that should play out is the bacteria, because they like to kill these larvae and then proliferate on the carcass of the larva. They would either modify a population of them that has a modified version of the crytoxin would arise and still fight against, this competitive nature. When you insert that gene into the corn, you've kind of locked the type of toxin that's being produced.
Okay.
So you're going to run out of time with the BT corn eventually, and you're either going to have to make a new BT corn or figure out a different method. And what is I kind of think about sometimes is if we're sort of ignoring these bacteria, that they might die off, right? And what's the library of genes that we're looking to modify our corn again? Well, it might be gone by the time we need to make a new type of corn. Something I think about, I guess.
Yeah, well, and who knows by that bacteria dying off, all the implications that could have just on, how nature works. That's interesting to think about.
Yeah, that's crazy to think about. Looks like we have a question here. The question is, has there been any hormone studies on GMOs, things such as increases in infertility, etc.? Jared?
I personally haven't come across any specific hormone studies on GMOs, but this Zach Bush guy that is in these seminar videos that we're watching, he has a company called Biometrics, or I forget the name of it, but he makes Restore for Life products. I don't know if you've ever seen those. And he funds some research, and what they have found is, at least in not so much GMOs, but just the glyphosate, they're finding that it upregulates when it interfaces with your gut, it upregulates the production of receptors that bind to gliadin, which is the part of the gluten protein that people get allergic to.
Right.
So, there's a lot of that going on.
Right.
I would assume that there's some type of hormonal effect with some of these superfluous proteins that are potentially being produced with all these mutations that are happening in a GMO, but I just haven't come across any specific.
Sure. So I guess the direct answer to that question is maybe not, but all these red flags.
Yeah.
Maybe
not, but it would not surprise me if there is.
Well, yeah, there's definitely some links between gut problems and infertility, so food sensitivities and infertility.
You connect the dots between this and this, and you can connect the two. Yeah.
So maybe talk about that a little bit. So how the glyphosate was used to speed up the process of how wheat was harvested.
Yeah, because one of the things I know I've come across, Facebook feed, whatever, is different articles talking about people really aren't gluten intolerant. They're intolerant to Roundup or whatever. So
and that's kind of I guess
clickbait,
maybe so there's something to that, but I would say that it's probably an inaccurate statement. They're still sensitive or allergic even to the what he mentioned, the gliadin that's in the gluten. Or when you break down gluten, that's what it gets to. But that what the glyphosate potentially is doing, or maybe they've shown that this is what it does, is kind of enhances that effect of how we would be sensitive to it.
Sure.
And also then throws off the fiber to gluten ratio. So now there's a lot less fiber and way more gluten in the wheat product, as opposed to how it used to be where our bodies could handle the gluten.
Yeah. So
there.
we had talked about this a number of weeks ago. One of the weeks you were specifically talking about food, and you made us a quick point about how like people have been eating, like making bread forever, but like just recently there's been this hoopla about gluten intolerance, and like it's not that our bodies were not made to be able to like digest this stuff. It's like something changed, and this is not the same food.
Yeah, not the same food. And again, when it's combined with the glyphosate, it just changes how our bodies, I guess, absorb it and deal with it.
Or at least according to the study that this group that Zach Bush is part of is seeing. And I think they're going to be releasing that paper to the Journal of Nutritional Chemistry or something, Nutritional Medicine. I can't remember what the name of the journal was. Here in the next couple months, I think is what he said.
Yeah.
So.
Where are we at? How much time we got here?
Oh, we're good, dude.
We're good.
Yeah.
Guess we haven't done it for 3 weeks. We keep going.
Losing stamina.
Maybe let's hit on, and maybe this isn't kind of where your expertise is at in this genetically modified discussion, but what about when they say how they try to justify all the GMO stuff because we just can't make enough food to feed the planet?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Well, on face value, it seems like a very compelling argument. But like I was talking to you about before about the idea of the BT corn and kind of running out of our gene library to keep modifying it.
Yeah.
I wonder even about the sustainability of fighting our environmental problems this way.
Yeah.
The thing is, and they talked about this in the seminar series, and I don't have like a number for how much land it is, but the government here literally pays farmers to not farm
organically.
No, just not farm.
Just not farm. Period.
Right. So there are a lot of farmers who have a lot of their fields in what's called CRP. It's like a conservation. I forget what the R stands for program, and they just kind of leave it planted with grass, and they just don't plant a crop there. So there's a lot of land across our country that is just locked up in this this government program. It's just being unused to produce food.
And what's the purpose of it?
I don't know for sure.
I think they.
It probably has something to do with, protecting like the market of the corn and making sure that it doesn't go haywire and stuff. But maybe having a farmer answer that question would be better.
Okay.
Yeah, I thought it. I'm trying to remember what they were talking about on it too. It was something about they just need to. How they describe it is they want to save big portions of land in case something really bad goes down. They have kind of these backups, is what they're doing. But the guy related it to genetically modified foods and how that if we were to use all this land, then somehow it would show evidence that that it's not necessary to be using genetically modified foods to be able to feed the world.
So it's like there's no real problem. It's like fear of a potential problem is driving these absurd, massive changes in how we're making food.
Yeah.
Yeah, and not to mention that we're already failing at feeding the world, even with the rate at whatever our yields are supposed to be at one point with better GMO crops. That's not going to catch up to the rate of the multiplication of the human race on the planet. It's projected to be like 10 billion in like 5 or 10 years or something like that.
Yeah.
As long as the Arguellas are still around.
Yep.
Okay, so what is... It seems like one of the big themes has been, this is a pretty new thing. There's not a ton of super clear lines besides like the few specific strands that you were talking about. But there's a lot of red flags. Like, what does this mean for somebody when they walk into their grocery store? Like, what should they be thinking about? Like, how do they know what they're buying? Like, what does this mean for people on a super practical level?
I mean, I think what it means is, like I was talking about before, is until we really know. I mean, I would say there's too many red flags to just say, okay, this is fine for me to eat. I don't think it's as important, and maybe it is, but just my understanding of it, I don't think it is as important right now for me so like if you have all these things thrown at you and you're eating a standard American diet and you say, this is what you got to change this and this and this and this, like if that was going to overwhelm you and you're just like, okay, just give me a couple things that I need to change. The sugar and industrial seed oils and vegetable oils for me right now are still more important
above GMOs
than above GMOs. But thankfully, if you are avoiding sugar and vegetable oils, most likely you're going to be avoiding a lot of genetically modified stuff anyway. Because again, our bodies are amazing. Our bodies are resistant. Our bodies are hardy. There's probably other words that I could be using for this, but you know, when we take in a genetically modified food, it's most likely not going to cause us a huge issue right now. Now, there probably are some people that will be super susceptible to ingesting specifically glyphosate, but also genetically modified foods. You know, there's a lot of neurological issues that, you know, some people are trying to trace back to glyphosate, specifically autism. So there might be something, just somebody has a genetic predisposition to being susceptible to something like that. So for those people, then yes, this is for sure something you should avoid until we know more about it. But just for the general population, yes, pay attention to it. But, you know, it's not something that we need to be putting, I guess, above real food and above staying away from vegetable oils and sugar.
How far-reaching is it beyond corn and soybeans?
Well, cotton is a major crop that is genetically modified. You probably study the legislation and stuff more than I do, but I think those are the three basic crops that are still legal to use a GMO.
Okay.
There's already been a GMO wheat created. It just has not, I think, been introduced into our farming system, our food supply. I've read, you know, they've made GMO versions of a lot of different crops. There's been GMO papaya. I think they've had GMO tomatoes. And I mean, it's growing. The industry for it is growing. I mean, they're getting into a lot of different crops, but I just think those three are the only ones that are legal to be on market right now.
Okay. So when somebody does go into Walmart, Aldi, Hy-Vee, whatever, the majority of that stuff is going to be in those packaged foods, the stuff that are using soy and corn, like, to make up a huge percentage of what they're actually made of. Yep. When they go buy apples and they're looking at, you know, organic apples versus the ones on the other side of the store, like, they're not making a choice of like something that's genetically modified. Like, there's a difference there. So can we draw a distinction between what GMOs are, what like conventionally grown crops are, and what organic is? Because I think that's something that's definitely fuzzy.
I think the only way to really know that you're not getting something that potentially is genetically modified is having organic, organic produce. Just because there's, I think, maybe even the ways that it's delivered from the farm to the store, there might be something going on with. They use corn for everything, so you might know more about that process of, you know, how it's made into ethanol and potentially what ethanol is used for and all those different things. But yeah, just to be the safest, again, organic is how you're going to know it's not
Right.
on there.
Yeah, and I think it's good to understand when you're eating, I guess, a highly processed product of corn, say high fructose corn syrup or cornstarch. At that point, it really, to me, in my mind, doesn't matter if you get it from a GMO corn or a organic corn, because it's been processed to a point to that it's pure high fructose corn syrup. There's not, I mean, the method.
The GMOs are not the reason you're gonna have a problem with that.
Yeah, it's like I hear a lot of people, say sometimes like I don't want to buy that. It's got GMOs in it. I'm just like,
you should.
That's not your issue.
No, it's like you got a fundamental misunderstanding going on here. Or the same with sugar. If you get the white processed sugar, it's not going to matter if you get the cheap C&H cane sugar or an organic version. But I mean, if you get raw sugar, where it has some of the molasses still there and everything, you're going to get a different profile of nutrients on the two.
Yeah.
I think that was helpful.
Yeah, but like you said, the cotton, which we would, in the cottonseed oil, I guess, what you're going to ingest, and then the soy and the corn. They're the main things that you would have to worry about. But again, if you're staying away from, that's not just going to eat a soybean or going to eat corn. That is a problem, but there's soy is in so many things and corn is in so many things, and it's used for so many other reasons. So Yep. And our water. Let's get to our water.
Ooh, I didn't know this was even coming.
Well, this is more related to glyphosate, though.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and then maybe we should just not say this episode's solely genetically modified foods. We can talk about the whole glyphosate and GMO stuff, because right now we know, I think, more about glyphosate being a problem than genetically modified foods being a problem.
Yeah. Well, the original theory goes is glyphosate, when it's applied to a crop, it'll kill the weeds that you want it to kill, and then what just kind of lands in the soil, the microbes in our soil, they will break the glyphosate down, and it eventually just gets converted to carbon dioxide, and it's a non-persistent spray. But it takes in the soil, about 8 to 10 days for it to finish breaking down, maybe longer. If it gets into the water, it will still break down, but it takes, I think, up to like 2 months to finish breaking down. So if you've got fields next to, let's say in Davenport here, fields next to the Mississippi River, because we get Iowa American Water pulls water out of the river, purifies it, and then sends it to all of our houses. If you get glyphosate runoff, say a farmer applied it and it rains and it runs off into the river, upstream of the waterworks, the treatment works, you're inevitably going to get glyphosate into the treatment works. And it's very hard, because they don't do a biological treatment in the treatment of drinking water, I don't think. So it's very difficult to remove a molecule like glyphosate from the water. And one of the final steps of the water treatment is removing the pathogens. So you're removing the bacteria that could possibly break it down, and it takes a lot less than 1 to 2 months to treat the water for drinking. So if there's a glyphosate runoff in our river, we're most likely inevitably going to be drinking it downstream. At what concentration, I don't know. If it's in the parts per million or parts per billion, and how big of an effect that has on us and everything. But in my mind, I would rather just have zero, a flat zero ingestion of glyphosate.
Yeah.
So like we went through how bad glyphosate is potentially for your body. So people are probably thinking, well, they spray the plants with glyphosate, so if I eat that food, then I'm going to get glyphosate in me. But that's not necessarily the case, because the glyphosate's going to...
Well, it's possible still. I've just been starting to read about glyphosate's ability to adsorb to leaf tissue on a plant when it sticks there. And then I think if that happens, it adsorbs to the leaf, or even the stem or whatever. It's going to be protected from microbial attack. So it's possible, I think it's possible to still ingest glyphosate even from the food. Because once it kind of gets under the first couple layers of plant tissue, it's after it absorbs, it's not going to be broken down by the bacteria at that point.
So you want it to get in the soil, because that's where most of the bacteria is going to be at to be
Yeah,
able to
well,
break it down.
any of the glyphosate that does not hit your target plant, you want it to end up in the soil so that it breaks down. But I mean, they spray this ubiquitously, so it's inevitably going to hit
Everything.
any crop or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's not necessarily, do we know, like, does it compound? So since they're always spraying and they spray everywhere, like, is it still that 10 or whatever days that it's just always going to break down like that? So does it really matter how much they're spraying, because it's always going to break down in 10 days?
Theoretically, yes. I don't know what the long-term effects would be and how, because it acts as a antibiotic, and how much that's going to disrupt the microbiome in the soil, and if those bacteria that are there to break it down now, if they'll be there 50 years from now,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in the soil, in the water, on the plants, definitely can get in us multiple ways.
Boy, okay. So you brought it up a few minutes ago, but like, our whole idea is, like, it's not just this, like, happy, nostalgic feeling of, human life is supposed to look like it always did, and it's not like the good old days. It's like, from experience, we can see that when we mess with how human life was designed to function, bad things usually happen. And, like, that's kind of just applying that reasoning and that experience to this new subject of GMOs, the glyphosate. Like, it's there's reason to take that stance.
Yeah. Can we think of anything that's good about it?
Ooh.
I would say probably the only really positive argument you can make for the GMOs and the use of glyphosate is just how simple it's made to produce a lot of food. But how nutritious that food is, we don't know. I mean, because just for example, we were kind of mentioning how it was used to increase the wheat production. Usually a wheat plant, there's only time in the year to get one harvest, because the wheat has to grow, it has to seed, and then it has to dry out before they harvest it. But what they do with, now that they have glyphosate, is it grows, it seeds, they spray it, so it dies early, and then they harvest that and plant it again and get 2 crops per year. So on face value, that would seem like, oh, that's a great thing. We're getting way more food per year. But then again, we don't know any of these. We don't know much about any of these underlying effects that are going on, with the fiber to gluten ratio thing, and how the life cycle of the plant gets affected, or how that ratio gets affected from changing the natural life cycle of the plant.
Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, like, when we've talked about this, I guess, perspective that you brought up there with medicine, like, there's definitely some amazing things that just technology and researching the body of how we've been able to produce these medicines or drugs or surgeries or tests that are amazing and save people's lives. And there's a lot of good from that. So that's a good thing, and we should continue that. But of course, since we are still intervening with the body. We're doing something that the body hasn't necessarily done for thousands of years. There's potential for bad things to happen. And it's very clear that that is the case. That's the same thing that's happening with this whole genetically modified food and chemical of glyphosate, how there's just bad things that are going to happen. We might not know exactly what they are and how they happen, but there's bad things that for sure are going to happen. And I don't know that there's any good things like we can find, identify with medicine. I don't know if there is any good stuff that's going on.
I'm not sure I could think of a really good argument, at least in the context of producing our food. But I mean, some of the other products we use corn for, like the ethanol production and whatnot, I could see a potential good argument for that if we were just modifying the use of these non-consumable corn and then just using that and not spraying anything on it, maybe I wouldn't I wouldn't sign my name to that argument, but I could see it as potentially a good one.
Sure.
Yep.
Cool.
So yeah, as always, try to be as close to how people have used to live for a long, long, long time. And not that everything that we've changed and adapted to has been bad, but we just got to be careful about it, right? Got to look into it before we just assume it's good.
Yeah.
Yep. Now let's talk about powerlifting, because Jared just got into powerlifting.
Newfound powerlifter. We can do that. Yeah. We got 3 minutes until our hour. Not that we have to stop at an hour. There is one comment on here that I want to get to. It was one of the first ones right here. Oh, first of all, Nathan says, "Looking sharp, Doc." You can read who this is from. Jared, you have the perfect voice for a sleep radio podcast.
Yeah.
I mean that in the best way possible.
Who said that? I can't see.
You can.
Oh, Sam. Yeah.
So, cool. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you for tuning in. Questions? If you are not as educated as one of these dudes, you're gonna have some questions about some things that just happened. Feel free to put those in here, Facebook, YouTube, wherever you're watching this, and we can try to get to those. So, and if this brought up other topics you want to hear about, let us know. Okay, thank you very much. See you guys soon.
All right.